We've talked a lot about utopian communities, or I have anyway. But of course, and I've alluded to the Brook Farm experiment, the Brook Farm community that was set up in West Roxbury, Connecticut, on a couple of different occasions. Now we're going to get a little bit more into it because Peabody also published a plan of the West Roxbury community, a kind of explanation of who we are and what we're doing, because they moved out there in 1841 to 47. She was there, George Ripley, Orestes Brownson, Margaret Fuller, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Christopher Pierce Cranch, Charles King Newcomb, a whole slew of people decided, artists and writers and musicians and philosophers and educators and activists, reformists of every sort, decided, let's pool our resources, let's buy a farm, we'll farm in the daytime, early in the morning, and we'll have plenty of time in the evening to, one, pursue our art, and two, share our work with others in a community of people where we'll sort of feed off of each other symbiotically. We'll draw inspiration from one another. We'll be a community of writers and artists, and there's no end to what benefit we can get by being together. Now, that sounds wonderful. It sounds terrific, and it certainly is in keeping with the huge amount of utopianism that was going on in this highly optimistic period of the 19th century. But, of course, the first and chief issue, this was brought up by Perry Miller, is whether or not what we're dealing with when we deal with Brook Farm is a transcendental oxymoron. Because after all, transcendentalism's main, if you will, motto was self-reliance. And this is a commune. I mean, this is a communal thing where people share stuff. They have a common dining area, and they had their own rooms and things, but they pooled their resources. They owned property together in common. They worked for the common good, and so I had a management team that was elected. I mean, it's a commune basically. It's like a kibbutz in Israel or something like that, where they run it as community property. And Miller says this is where the chief issue of society versus solitude comes up with the Romantics. Now, not all of these people living there are transcendentalists. Okay, Hawthorne was no transcendentalist. Brownson probably could be considered a transcendentalist. Ripley was a quasi-transcendentalist, and so on and so forth. So not all these guys were believers in transcendentalism, but they certainly, even the Romantics like Hawthorne, who weren't transcendentalists, were very big believers in self-reliance, that turning to society, turning to the collective group is not the way to find answers, and is not the way to achieve lasting society-wide reform. So it's all the more curious why they would do this. So this is a paradox. People have debated it for a long, long time. But the community thrived for a few years, and then, like most of these ventures, tended to fail. The principles of its organization were cooperation in social matters instead of competition or balance of interests, and individual self-unfolding. That's a very transcendental phrase, self-unfolding. In the faith of that, in the faith that the whole soul of humanity is in each man and woman. People are a microcosm of humanity, right? The whole soul of humanity is within each of us. It's our job to turn inward and find and get in touch with that. And so this was it was a rather loosely based group. It was not something that was onerous. It was no cult, for example. You could come and go if you wanted to. You had to raise the money to do it. Frankly, Hawthorne joins largely because, as a young, struggling writer who was going from employment to unemployment and back, he figured if I go there, I can save up enough money, write enough short stories, publish them so that I can marry, guess who? Sophia, sister of Elizabeth Palmer Peabody. He was in love with Sophia and thought as a bachelor I could save a lot of money by doing this. Didn't quite work out that way. Didn't end up writing a lot after you've shoveled manure for 6 hours. Lo and behold, you don't really feel like sitting down and writing lofty nonfiction, fiction, or even poetry for that matter. By 1844, the community started to decline, as you can imagine. It became a Fourierist community, following the teachings of Charles Fourier, who believed in this sort of phalanx structure of organization. A graduate student once pointed out to me, and I've never been able to verify this, but the Fourierist movement by the French utopianist Charles Fourier had different kinds of communities all over the country, organized them. He wanted to restructure all of society through little communities all over the place, and that some of these people met together at a place called Reunion, which is now in a spot that is occupied by, or was occupied by, this place called Reunion Arena in Dallas. In other words, Reunion Arena, or that spot, I guess they've torn it down, I'm not sure, was originally called Reunion because it was where the Fourierists, who had founded different utopian colonies, got together after many years and reunited there in that very spot. So there's a utopian community connection right here in Dallas. Peabody's trying to give a sort of explanation of the community, why they live the way they do, what they're doing, and so on, in order to sort of justify what they're doing, give a philosophical basis for it, and so on. We've talked a lot about utopian communities, or